So after my last video on the Metro series over the Starfish, I decided it was time to take a little bit of a hiatus, but after that rest has been concluded, it's time to get back to the horrifying monstrosities that lurk in the ruins of Russia, looking for any creatures whom they may consume. Today, we have a creature not seen anywhere else, and for good reason. These beasts lurk in the lower portions of the Metro in Novosibirsk, snacking on Nasalis and humans who tread across their path. Today, we are talking about the worms. So let's get to the lore and morphology of these worms from Metro Exodus and try to figure out, firstly, where they come from, but secondly, why does their environment look like someone threw up their guts for the last 20 years straight everywhere? The smell must be horrible. Time to put on those gas masks, and not just for the radiation. To understand how these creatures form, we must first figure out what happened in Novosibirsk and why it was such a target during the war. Originally, Novosibirsk was the third largest city in Russia. During its time as a normal functional place, science was in full swing pre-war. During this time, many advancements were made, some good and some bad. Bad would be the biological weapon that they were working on that would be dropped on populations, causing lungs to melt and mutations to mount. Good would be something referred to as the green stuff. Apparently, at some point, this didn't look too good to the United States. And now this is more of an opinion, but nobody was really innocent in the nuclear war, with both sides committing atrocities. But this is why this particular city would be hit the hardest. To put a stop to the experiments taking place, the US would make sure nothing could possibly be left alive in the area. And for the most part, this would have succeeded if there weren't the aforementioned green stuff. When the US kicked off the war, 2 bombs that we know of were dropped, along with varying other nuclear options. But these main 2 were the biological bomb dropped in Moscow, hence all the mutants and standing buildings. Novosibirsk, however, would have probably been happy to receive these mutants instead of what they actually had dropped on them. A special type of weapon called a cobalt bomb was used to attack that had extreme consequences for anyone caught out in the open, but even still had consequences for those in the shallow metro tunnels. The soldier yelling, "This is it," was the correct assumption. The cobalt bomb was dropped with the intentions to blanket the area with an overkill level of radiation. Everything it touches will almost immediately receive a lethal dose. On top of this, it will seep through the ground into the basements, bunkers, tunnels, whatever you think you're safe in, you actually aren't. This allowed the buildings to stay standing as we see, but it's essentially a ghost town above and below. The levels of radiation were so high that they are actually measured at 8 times what we see in Moscow. For reference, Artyom went and hung out on the surface quite regularly as long as he had air and a suit. Presumably, he would spend hours out on the surface looking for other survivors on the radio. When entering Novosibirsk, however, not only did they have to lead line the car, but they had to wear special lead line suits over their normal gear that would have been, completely viable in Moscow. Even with all these extra precautions, they still would receive a nearly lethal dose just by being outside for a very short amount of time. Descending into the metro, they would find out there was evidence of human life and traffic. Much like how Moscow had many different settlements in their metro, so too did Novosibirsk. However, the rules of this area were quite different. The only way they were able to continue a life below ground and still in the presence of deadly radiation levels was due, once again, to the green stuff. The green stuff worked by clearing the body of radiation to stop people succumbing to the illness induced by the cobalt bomb. However, as time passed, resources would dwindle, which would lead to a whole host of issues. The military tried to escape out of the tunnels, and when the civilians found out that they were hoarding the green stuff and were going to leave them for game men, a civil war broke out that left only 2 survivors, and in time, only 1 survivor, who would be the little boy that you run into. Now, specifically, we need to learn about this green stuff because it's important to understand what it does versus what we think it does. This particular anti-radiation medicine seems to have a relatively short life concerning potency in the body. Artyom was seen using it exiting the tunnels and ascending to the surface, and yet not too long after, he was succumbing to the radiation once more. Now, it could be that the body is diluting it, or that it could just be truly so powerful and saturated on the surface with radiation that even the green stuff cannot hold out. The people of the metro would have access to this for a while, however, it doesn't appear to fix damage to the genetic coding of the body. Instead, it just absorbs radiation rather than your cells absorbing it. So that brings up the question, while those down in the metro of Novosibirsk were technically alive, was their DNA being altered probably heavily during their times down in the metro? I would say even if they were utilizing the green stuff, this is more than likely the case. So my general operating idea at this point is, despite the people's survival directly linked to the green stuff, because it technically does clear the body of dangerous levels of radiation, damage done to the genetic coding of a person was still quite prevalent amongst the population. And this is massively important in determining how this particular area formed and became what it is. So first, let's talk about the environment, even though in the intro I said it would be switched. It looks like a mass of skin and intestines. It's very clearly organic, so horrifyingly then, what is it? Well, there is a possibility that this is actually human cells blanketing the area. The human environment and nutrients in the area actually make this even more possible than you might think. In Moscow, we also see that it is possible concerning the monster under D6, but remember that was a biological bomb dropped in the area. In Novosibirsk, this may actually be linked to just straight up real world science, and here's how. Cancer is nothing but a biological POS. These cells feed off the host body. Usually in multicellular organisms, to stay alive, you are supposed to play by the rules, but cancer uses nutrients in the body, and instead of responding to the body's calls for apoptosis, they will continue to grow and flourish, leading to the host to either have those cells removed or their expiration. But cancer cells are also extremely resilient. Take Henrietta Lacks, for instance. In 1951, she went in for bleeding and they discovered that she had a malignant tumor in her cervix. Regrettably, she did not survive, but interestingly, her cells were not like her other cells. In environments outside the body, her cells would quickly expire, yet the cancer cells continued to thrive and doubled every 20 to 24 hours. The cells essentially shirked their duties to keep the organism alive and instead, in favor, chose a more singular existence. Today, trillions of her cells exist in the scientific community and have aided us in the study of drugs, hormones, virus growth, radiation, poisons, information on the human genome, and they even help in development of the polio vaccine. Essentially, this woman's cells have helped humanity jump forward medically quite a bit. The takeaway, however, is that these cells can exist where other human cells fail, despite them technically being human cells and having her genome. However, for them to become cancerous like this, genetic mutation is likely the culprit. A cell stopped responding to commands and unfortunately could not be taken out. But because of this, these cells can now grow in growth media where normally human cells would expire. What we are looking at in this environment is the result of survivors no longer having access to the green stuff and their mutations in their cells mounting. This organic growth is the remains of the people who were more than likely descended further into the metro, and due to the warmer, more humid environment, their cells continue to divide and grow, covering everything in the area. Nutrients supplied by the water and surrounding areas, considering that the worms brought back food, would likely be absorbed by the cancerous human cells and fuel their growth even further. So with that horrifying realization, what could be worse? Well, how about giant leeches that crawl their way through a system of flesh and water? Did I say leeches? Of course. Interestingly, in the real world, you'll find right now, leeches are quite prevalent in Russian medicine. Being used quite a bit for ailments, this would make sense. Despite radiation constantly knocking on the door, you would still find sickness down in the close quarters of the metro. Because of this, leeches would likely have been used to treat a variety of issues. These creatures would quite clearly be in the system of this metro because of their usefulness. Another thing to also note is that why they would be down there, at least, is did you know that leeches can also be used to treat cancer pain in some instances? Considering what humanity was faced with at this point, this would be imperative for them to have these leeches on hand, as most people would more than likely be suffering some forms of cancer. But moving into why they're leeches, why aren't they centipedes, considering they are carnivorous and have jaws and legs? Well, for a variety of reasons, but the main one being the low oxygen levels of today's planet would not support any insect being as large as these creatures are. Now, don't get me wrong, we do start to push the limits of bodily capacity of a leech concerning these creatures' size, but there is reason to believe that these creatures could actually live in this environment and continue to grow. First and foremost, believe it or not, leeches actually do tolerate low oxygen environments very well. This would be integral to their survival long term in the metro of Novosibirsk. Even currently on this planet, we see some leeches are able to get up to 45 centimeters, which is just a little over 17 inches long in freedom units. As such, their growth can be quite sizable given enough time. Secondly, they can go quite a while without eating. Now, usually leeches are snacking on the Nasalis that one or two close, but it's pretty much assumed at this point humans were on the menu as well. And the environment they find themselves in would have nutrients for them to consume should they be hungry enough. Now let's take a look at the varying sizes of these creatures. Closer to the entrance, we see that these leeches exhibit a smaller size in proportion to those we find deeper within. This would say to me that these particular leeches are related to the larger ones, but are just smaller, perhaps even younger. The relation I find also is the ability to produce the acidic spit. Despite all the different apparent sizes, this seems to be a common ability shared amongst the leeches. This was more than likely born out of necessity to regurgitate acid onto the surrounding cellular coverings to break them down and absorb the nutrients locked away inside. However, further out, finding smaller and younger leeches seems to be appropriate, as the cellular matrix we find deeper hasn't really advanced out to the front area as much. And it could be because of temperature issues or even radiation, but this thinner layer of cell growth would support less sizable creatures. However, moving further into the tunnels, we find that's where they're hiding the real nightmare fuels. In this area, leeches are roughly 15 to 20 feet in length, or about 4.5 to 6 meters meters long. Their acid ability can be shot at quite a range, and they are large enough to pull a full-grown man under the water. If you needed more reassurance on how they might actually be leeches, they still retain some of the morphological traits from their smaller, less aggressive size. If you look closely, you can see little black dots on their face. These are light-sensing organs. Not so much like eyes like we have where we can see a range of colors. They instead sense how bright a light is and where it's coming from. This is how they are able to locate Artyom and begin their attack. Leeches also have another trait, their ability to sense movement in their environment via vibrations. When Artyom is running around knocking down trains, dropping boats in the water, or just rowing in general, this would alert the leeches to movement in the area and basically dinner is here. But if it just came down to their sucker ability, this wouldn't amount to much. So these particular leeches have jaws evolved probably through the massively mutagenic radiation in this area. These jaws now stick out and actually appear to look like centipede jaws, but in reality, they are still naturally homegrown leeches. These jaws would need to have been grown over time. However, seeing as the younger leeches closer to the entrance do not have these jaws yet, this would mean that it's sort of like a teething process. And considering how their genomes would be altered, this is not too far-fetched to think that these could have developed since they already have jaws and teeth in place. Their segmented bodies also appear to have developed feet. Well, leech feet. Very dissimilar to our own, but they now exist to aid in swimming and moving on surfaces. So there you go, I mentioned feet in this episode. This would have been invaluable considering at first their prey would more than likely be terrestrial rather than aquatic. But also they can now move up and eat the cancerous cells that more than likely do not exist underneath the waterline. These leeches are quite successful in a number of ways because their original form was also hermaphroditic, meaning that they possess both male and female organs. These leeches seem to have moved past this need, however, for one another and are now asexual creatures. I base this on their ability to quite literally shoot worms at Artyom when he enters their tunnel. These worms are housed in the spit of these creatures, so this means that they are being formed inside of the leech rather than just the area of the body designated for reproduction. So essentially, these particular leeches stalk the lower portions of the Metro and Novosibirsk. Due to the extreme radiation, this caused humans in the area's cells to become so damaged that eventually they just became completely cancerous. This covered the area in an organic material, which in turn fed the leeches and formed a microclimate and ecosystem capable of leading to the size increase. And in turn, they survived, allowing their mutations to amass as well into what we see here today, a horrifying giant worm creature that will exist in your nightmares forever. So thank you everyone for watching. What do you think about my hypothesis? Leave a comment down below on your idea. Also, leaving a like helps get the video out there, and subbing is a great way to stay informed when I post occasionally. If you did find it interesting, I will drop my Twitter, merch, Discord, and Patreon links to all those who are interested, and I would like to thank a few of my patrons. It's Not a Spoon, Joseph Givens, The Lone Titan, and Freedom Units 44. Thank you guys for your awesome support. And to the rest of my patrons, I want to say thank you as well. You guys are awesome. All right, so that does it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.